Well, we're very fortunate to have Puru with us because they don't have power up there where they are. Through his prescience, a few years ago, they got a generator that runs everything when the power goes out, and I'm sure that his prescient abilities were there preparing him for this very moment to be sure they would have internet when we tried to do this meeting, and probably many other things as well they're doing. I don't know if you're aware, but the PG&E in especially the fire-prone areas is doing rolling blackouts to try to keep the sparking activity down, I assume.
Is that like all parts of California, or just certain parts? Or
certain parts? PG&E is getting better. Last year, they just kind of flipped the off switch and shut down most of Northern California. But this year, they're more targeted. They figured out how to just shut the regions down that they think are going to have high winds. It's the high winds that does it. They don't so much worry about the sparking all the time, but when there's really high winds predicted coming through the Bay Area, coming through Mount Diablo, that area, then they just shut it down. Very strange.
do they give you guys advance notice?
Yes, they give you lots of notice. They're good about it. They explain it. They tell you how long they think it's going to last.
Oh, okay.
And they're just going from what the weathermen are telling them. So,
okay.
But they're pretty good. And it comes back on when they say. But of course, it's going on 3 days that it's been off. Yeah.
Oh my!
So does the whole village have generators back, or is this just you? Or I mean,
some do, some don't. Most of the buildings, the work, where we do our work, or the market where we often go, they have generators. But I would say more people than not do not have generators.
Okay.
I was saying the phone system is kept in place with the generator, and therefore we have the internet that allows us to connect.
Yes. So you should all say a prayer and cross your fingers that the generator down there doesn't go out.
At least for the next hour and a half.
At least for the next hour and a half.
So is it like gas-powered propane?
Right. Mine? The one on my house?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
It's propane?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I want to welcome you all. It's very nice to have you all here with us. And of course, it's great to have Puru Selbie with us. Just a little bit of introduction. He is very highly qualified to talk about this subject because he's been in a variety of founding and managing positions in the world of Ananda communities. He came to Ananda in 1975, and he led some of the rebuilding of the community after the 1976 fire. And then he was sent to Europe, and he laid some of the groundwork in getting the energy started for the Ananda community there, which is in Italy, in Assisi. And then he spent time as the Ananda Village Manager, and then went to Ananda Seattle for, I think, about 7 years. And there he spearheaded the purchase and the creation of the Ananda Seattle Community. And he's also been director of Expanding Light and the IT director and head of Crystal Clarity, and I'm sure the list goes on. And at the same time as all this, managed to raise 4 children with his wife, Lakshmi. So as you can see, he's a guy who likes to stay busy. And I haven't even mentioned the books he's written. Some in particular we use practically as Bibles, the one on the Yugas and the physics of God, and one's about to come out, maybe he'll mention it. I said about to, but the next one out, at least whenever it is the psychology of God. So Puru, it's great to have you here and to hear whatever you have to say.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Makes me blush slightly, but I did do all those things. So what I really was inspired to talk about and turned out to fit well with what people had wanted to learn about communities and life in communities, is a core dynamic between in the Ananda communities, between it being an ashram and it being a sort of community where people live and work and have schools and make their outward lives. So you have this inner life, which is the heart of being in the ashram, and then you have your outer life to blend in with that. And that dynamic is very powerful. I want to say before I go further here that I will open up for questions fairly soon. I don't have a lot of pre-thought comments to make. So, after, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes, maybe we can open up for questions and go wherever you want to go. So the ashram component of anything that Ananda does, whether it's a small group in the country or in the city living in the same house, whether it's an urban community with an apartment setup, or whether it's a rural community like Ananda Village, where I am now, ashram is at the heart. So a lot of people say that Ananda is a 21st century ashram. And I think that's very true. There's a lot of things that we do that are definitely not in your traditional ashram. We have couples, married couples. We have couples with children. And that is not your normal thing that you find in any ashram, certainly in India. And it adds to the dynamic of any community to have that mixture of sort of life stages, life ashrams that people are in. But in another way, we're not a 21st century ashram in the deepest sense. In the deepest sense, what you're doing when you move into an Ananda community is you're affirming that you want to grow in spirit. You want to change. You want to transform yourself to know God more deeply, more completely, and to be a channel for that. And that is a very powerful commitment to make. On the other hand, you have in any community, whether it's a small house or an urban community or a rural community, people need to be able to make it work on a practical level. You need to be able to earn a living, or the ashram needs to be able to have income so that you can be paid by the ashram to do things for the ashram. But money is there. Money is a real thing that we all have to deal with in community. And because we choose ashram over sort of worldly practicalities, money is often tight. So that dynamic is also a major part of living in any Ananda community, is the necessity to make it work, to make ends meet, to have housing, and as it grows, to add things like creating schools for children, or figuring out ways to make that work for families within the community context. But ashram is always the most important. The spiritual life that you're committing to is always the most important. And I believe last week, when you were listening to Jyotish and Devi, that they mentioned this dynamic between the spiritual director and the community manager that Jyotish, I think, was a little too self-deprecating when he said the spiritual director's job is simple because all we have to do is be concerned with everybody's spiritual welfare, where the community manager is more complicated because he or she has to deal with money, and if you're in a rural situation, buildings and maintenance and so forth. But I would say that the more challenging position really is that of the spiritual director. On the village manager side, you're really trying to make things happen that are not that unusual in the context of the world in which we live in. You're going to build a building in a spiritual community, you're going to build it pretty much the same way as you're going to build it if you have a home in LA County. A lot of things that the village manager has to deal with are what you might say, ordinary things that need to be coordinated, need to be done as well as possible, need to be done as much as possible in harmony with everybody's needs. But in some ways, it's more straightforward than the spiritual director, because the spiritual director not only is looking out for the spiritual welfare of each individual, the spiritual director will at times overrule the manager in something they're wanting to do, or that enough people in the community are wanting to do that it draws the attention of the spiritual director. So let me give you a concrete idea. So as I already alluded to, when you live in a spiritual community, generating enough income to make everything work is an ongoing challenge. And so there are lots of ideas in any group, any Ananda group, in any community situation, lots of ideas put forward about, well, we could make money doing this. I know someone who did this and they were very successful. I know this works and we could go do that. In one instance, a very practical idea was put forward, and I think there were others, but this is one in particular that I knew about, that would have allowed us to create a business that could probably have employed a number of people, especially family, heads of family who needed to earn income for more than just themselves. This business could, give them the kind of wage that would allow them to take care of kids. And so it was a real need. I mean, this was a strong contender to solve a lot of problems. And Swami stepped in and said, I don't think this kind of business would be in harmony overall with Ananda. And that was really hard for people to take because, the stakes are strong, especially if you have children. You really need a job. You really need a way to provide for your family. And so for Swami to step in and say that is an indication of this dynamic between ashram and community, ashram and village as it is here. But Swami never hesitated. And what he explained in this particular instance was that this idea would require that a lot of the employees of this business would not be community members. That we would have to bring in a certain level of expertise. We would also have to bring in more people than we had to hand. And he said, inevitably, when you have a mix of people who are committed devotees and those who are just in it for a job, you can't run it in the way you would run it if everyone was a devotee. For one thing, you wouldn't necessarily have chants playing while people are working. You wouldn't necessarily begin meetings to discuss business with a prayer. You wouldn't share with those people who are hired a common goal. Their goal would be profits and higher salaries, where your goal from a devotee's point of view might be different. So this is where I say I think the spiritual director role is really quite challenging to know when it's really definitely important to step in and head off things that from a practical point of view make sense. The dynamic also would occur with what work Swami would encourage people to get into. So Devi also often used to tell this sort of story in a joking manner that when people would come on a tour, she would say, just as a story, I would show them around, and they would always be interested in asking people who they meet in the process of this tour, you know, how did you get here and what do you do? And so at one point they were in a business that was sewing, I forget what at the time that we were sewing, and the person asked, a woman said, well, how did you get into this work? Did you have background in this? The woman pauses and says, well, sort of. I was a brain surgeon. So Swami would often put people to work where they had no experience and had no grounding in it from their previous history of work. So they didn't bring any of their preconceptions of self-importance, perhaps. If you were indeed a brain surgeon, you don't bring any preconceptions about what work you think is best for you. And Swami would put people in positions where it seemed to most of us that this person was guaranteed to fail, that they did not have the obvious attributes that fit that particular position. But Swami would do it because he could see in a depth that the rest of us rarely could, that this person needed this experience. They needed perhaps a complete change in the way they approached their work. And they needed to be awake and alive rather than on automatic. They needed to be challenged in a major way so that it would challenge their very sense of who they are and what they do. And in that way, grow them as devotees, but not necessarily grow them as workers. So this dynamic, as I say, just runs to the heart of community life, that things are not always done, decisions are not always made because they're practical. And I want to make it out that there are never practical decisions because most of the decisions are practical. But Swami would always keep it in the bounds of, let's do things that are good for us as devotees. We could perhaps be wildly successful at this other thing, but it would not deepen the spiritual life of everybody in the community, no matter how small or how large. And he never put people in positions that they could necessarily easily excel at, even though on a practical level you would think, somebody comes in who's been a manager of a small business, is very used to putting together ideas that would sell lots of things. You might put that person in the garden as a regular laborer rather than in the obvious place where they could, do the most good for the community. This takes a lot of getting used to, because I can talk about all these things with dispassion, because the ones I've talked about so far are the ones that happen to other people. But I could also tell you, but I won't, all the things that happened to me that Swami made decisions about that I could eventually, years later, appreciate why he did and in what way they were good for me. But I can't say that I immediately was in tune with many of those decisions. They, on the surface, they weren't what I wanted to do. On another level, they often weren't things that I felt like I could do very well. I often thought there were other things that I could do a lot better. And why didn't he put me there rather than where he did put me? And it was hard. I'll say it frankly, it was hard to be positive and embrace what was on offer and to take it with my own highest, best energy. And there were times when I just failed. I just really did not want to do that particular job to the extent where I did it so horribly that they had to take me out of it. And so you heard all the good things from Ramurti, but I have what I happily refer to as a checkered past at Ananda. I have as many shooting star glorious failures as I perhaps have successes. But what I learned, not easily, not quickly, is that I learned something from every one of those, whether it was a success or a failure. And in hindsight, I learned more from the failures. I learned more from the hard knocks. And it's in those times that I think I could transcend that discomfort only because at its heart, Ananda is an ashram. And I could embrace this notion that my commitment to Ananda as an ashram is my commitment to self-growth, to letting go of everything I need to let go of so that God can shine through. Davey used the analogy last week about it's for interpersonal work, it's as if we're all rocks that have been thrown into a tumbler and tumbled around. And so all the rocks bang against each other. And there certainly is a lot of rock banging. The larger your community gets, the more likely you are to find somebody with whom you're going to bang. But my favorite analogy for community was actually shared by Satchidananda, disciple of Shivananda, who had his own work on the East Coast of America and traveled extensively like Swami. And he visited Ananda a very long time ago, could have been 40 years ago. And he had us in stitches telling this story with his sweet Indian accent. He said, you know, when you come on the path, Divine Mother is very sweet to you. She sort of pats you, and she covers you in this nice, comforting blanket of love and care, and then she picks you up and she throws you in hot oil. And she said, when you lean into the hot oil, you know, you can hear it whining. You can hear it making noises that it doesn't want to be in the hot oil. But Divine Mother, she knows what she's doing, and she leaves you in the hot oil until you're soft and tender. And then she takes you out. So, fairly stark comparison. But there were times when I felt like the oil was pretty darn hot, and I wasn't sure that I really wanted to be in it. But because of that dedication to Ananda, to Swami, to Master, to wanting to find God, I learned from it, grew from it, and you know, it transformed me. I often think that if I were to run into my younger self today, I wouldn't recognize me. It is powerfully transforming to live in spiritual community. And that's the opportunity. That's the golden opportunity. Don't choose to live in spiritual community because you're hoping or expecting that it's going to be a continuous, wonderful experience of deep, sensitive relationships with other devotees. All that's there. The deepest relations I have are with devotees, people I've known for 45 or more years, and they're wonderful, and they mean a tremendous amount to me. But you kind of get to that wonderful relationship by a lot of banging together of rocks, not necessarily always with the same people, and through a lot of challenges. But when you let yourself be transformed, there's nothing like it. It's a huge, huge opportunity to grow spiritually. And growing spiritually, you want to give it your all. The more you can give it, the more you're going to grow. And the more you give it, the more challenged you're going to be. So I wish you with 100% conviction that you will do it, that you will somehow or another get into spiritual community, because it's the most wonderful thing that could ever happen to you in your entire life. But just be clear that you're going in for growth. You're going in to deepen your love for God. You're going in to get rid of the things that are keeping you from seeing God. And that it's not always a pleasure to get rid of those things. So leadership, I guess I'm touching on leadership already with this dynamic between the spiritual director and the various managers, community manager especially. But this dynamic is more obvious when your community reaches a certain size. Communities often start with, you know, what is essentially a group that could fit into a house, maybe a couple houses. And this is what's happening in Camino. And this is kind of the honeymoon phase of community. And it's nice to have a honeymoon. It's great to have a honeymoon, because then it gives you a foundation for when things don't go so well in the rest of your marriage. So I wish you the best honeymoon. And it will feel like a honeymoon in part because you're small enough to begin with for everything to be worked out very sensitively and in consensus. And it's very difficult when there's 12 of you or 15 of you to make a decision where one person is just totally unhappy with it, right? You figure out how to make it work for everybody, even if everybody is not equally happy, everybody is at least willing to go along with it. As you grow, consensus becomes incredibly time consuming and it becomes impractical. You know, you might have your group meeting and you have 20 items on your list, and after an hour you discover that you haven't figured out item 1 to everybody's satisfaction. You just can't function that way. So then you start naturally delegating responsibility to like subcommittees, and they make decisions and they bring them back to the group, and so there's less consensus. It's just a natural thing. It really is very difficult to do anything at scale in consensus. And then it just, as you grow, you get more and more leaders who emerge that end up working with the spiritual director and who just help make things happen. But I really want to stress that it doesn't matter if you're a leader at all. As things unfold, you may be drawn to it, you may be tapped to be a leader, but it doesn't mean anything in terms of your own spiritual worth, your own spiritual growth. It really doesn't. I have been in leadership roles for, you know, well over 40 of the nearly 50 years that I've been in Ananda, and still am in a couple of ways, but I'm far less so than I used to be, and it's really nice. It's really great not to have all that responsibility. So don't think that leadership is something that everybody is going to be drawn to, or that everybody needs to do, or should do, or you should do. It just happens. And the most helpful thing you can do really is appreciate as much as you can the challenge of being a leader. You know, any leader, especially in a spiritual community, does in fact want to make everybody happy. But every leader in a community of any size succeeds maybe 50% at that, or 75% if they're really good. And so there are always going to be people who are unhappy with the decision they make. And the best thing you can do is just cooperate with it, even if you don't like it. Even if you think there is a better solution, cooperate. You're in this together, and do what you can to be supportive of the leaders, because they're carrying a burden that you don't have to carry. So I think that was really the main things that I wanted to share with you. And maybe Ramurti, I can ask you if there are any of those bullet points that you sent me that I may have missed or you'd like me to delve into.
You want to say a little bit, you've covered it a little bit, but about this term we use, cooperative obedience?
Yeah, so many of you may know, just in case you don't, Swami began one of what turned out to be 2 different renunciate orders. The one you're probably most familiar with is the Nayaswami order, and the people who you have as your center leaders are, you know, Nayaswamis wearing blue, etc. But there's also another order that Swami began first, which he's called the Sevaka order. And the Sevaka order was I learned this just recently, was really aimed at people living in a community. He didn't really intend it to be something that went beyond the boundaries of a community, because some of the intentions wouldn't make as much sense out of the context of spiritual community itself, where you're living closely, working closely with others. And there are many things in that order. You could ask any of your center leaders to give you information on it. But one of the things that he did was that he took the traditional poverty, chastity, and obedience oath from Catholic monasteries, and he kind of reinterpreted them for our time and our age, and of course in our situation where we have this mix of sort of traditional renunciates, the brahmacharis who wear yellow, the single people who are not brahmacharis, couples, and then of course families. So he felt that these ideals should be embraced by everyone in the community, but he broadened them a bit so that it didn't come down to such stark choices. So for poverty, he substituted simplicity, and that as you embrace being in the Sevaka order, which is a free choice everybody makes within the community context, not everybody who lives here at the village is a Sevaka. But if you decide to become a Sevaka, you choose simplicity. And simplicity, Swami defined as keeping your lifestyle as free from complexity as you can, so that you have the maximum amount of time to serve and to go within, mostly to go within. Master often said that the problem with wealth is that wealthy people tend to make their lives so complicated that they can't think about anything except taking care of all the things that they now own and need to maintain. So he said, happiest are those who live a simple life. And this is what Swami wanted to make as a pillar of the order. Then for chastity, Swami substituted moderation for a couple of reasons. It's very difficult to always faithfully live up to a vow of chastity, even if you want to make that vow. And that in Swami's life experience and the things he observed, he found that it was a harsh winnower of souls, that if you couldn't manage it, you often felt very bad about yourself. And your only option was to leave the convent or the monastery, and in attitude of mind, even perhaps think you're leaving the spiritual path altogether because you failed in a very challenging task. Now, there's some people who love it and live it, and it is transforming for them. But there are others, especially married couples, for whom this would be not only a hardship, but it actually creates a dynamic in marriages that can be destructive, where you have one part of the couple that wants to be in chastity and the other doesn't. And it creates a very difficult challenge within that marriage, and often breaks people apart. So Swami just said, whatever you do, whether we're talking about sex or food or exercise or anything that you do in your life, do it in moderation. Don't get caught up in it for the sake of that. See it as a natural part of your life, and try not to be attached to it. And then lastly, for obedience, Swami came up with the term cooperative obedience for similar reasons to the idea of not wanting to impose chastity on people, which is that not everybody in a broader spiritual community like we tend to draw is really ready to do absolutely to the letter whatever the spiritual director tells them to do. And now, wise spiritual directors will almost never ask somebody to do something they absolutely don't want to do. Even in a monastery where, obedience is required. So spiritual directors know that. But on the other hand, Swami did not want to see somebody put in a position where they felt, for the sake of staying in the order, staying true to their vows, staying true to their determination, that they would fall into something that would make them, angry, bitter, upset, that they really, really didn't want to do it. And so he avoided that altogether, and he used that term cooperative obedience, meaning that if you're asked to do something by spiritual directors, or in a sense, if you're asked to do it by God and Guru, if things come your way that are obviously like right in front of you, asking to be done, that's why we would still counsel cooperative obedience, to really want to do it, want to be cooperative, want to make a leap that maybe is a bit challenging, but to also know when it's too big of a leap, when it's too much to ask of yourself to do that particular thing. You would do it with bad grace and bad energy, and you wouldn't like yourself and nobody would like you. So that's what he meant by cooperative obedience. And it's perhaps the most intuitive of the three, of simplicity, moderation, and cooperative obedience, because it's good to go talk to friends. It's good to talk to your spiritual director. It's good to meditate on it and try to tune into, is this the right thing for me? And if it is, it's great. But if not, in the right environment, which I think Ananda does a very good job with, you can be accepted for having said no. You don't have to pack up your tent and go. You don't have to feel like you've failed the broader community. You can be there and loved and accepted and embraced, and something else will come along, and that'll be the right thing that'll feel. So cooperative obedience is, in a way, cooperative obedience is the personal experience of the dynamic between ashram and community. It's where the rubber meets the road for us as individuals, rather than the abstract of the ashram having a purpose and the village having a complementary purpose. Ramurti, more?
Well, it would be interesting to just hear a little bit of a description about how the Seattle community got started right at the beginning. I mean, it's a little different. We're looking primarily, we hope for a more rural community, and that one is urban. But even so, could you just share a little bit about getting that off the ground?
Yes. I will preface it with the fact that there were already 2 other communities that had sort of pioneered the model that we used. And the first was Palo Alto. You heard a lot from Asha in the first session about the hurdles that they had and the successes they had forming apartment type community. So by the time we were wanting to do it in Seattle, I think Sacramento had already done a similar thing where they bought an apartment complex and had their community going there. And it's even possible that Portland had started, but I'm not sure. But at any rate, we were blessed by that model because we would have big meetings in our then temple, not the temple that exists now. Everybody in a big circle, and we would say, we think it would be a great idea for us to, buy an apartment complex somewhere and all live in it and have a community here. But I got to say, have a community here like the one in Palo Alto that everybody loves, rather than having to say, we want to buy an apartment complex, an old funky apartment complex, and stick all you guys in it. What do you think? So we had a big advantage that it already existed as a model. But it still took a lot of meetings. We did a lot of circles in the temple and had marathon meetings working out some of the details. We had a, several month process of trying to find a place that we liked enough to want to try to come up with the money for. And we found it really wasn't so much that it was old and funky that made it attractive. I mean, that did have an attraction because it was inexpensive. But the main thing that we liked and really worked for us is that it was built around a central area of lawn and a pool. So it gave us a natural place for people to gather. In Seattle, that natural place doesn't last as long as it does in California, but it still worked for that in our summer months when it wasn't raining. So that was really what sold us on this, and it had about the right number of units. And we, put in an offer, and then we had to come up with the way to buy it. Now, the way to buy it was also pioneered by Santoshi, who helped get the apartments bought for Palo Alto. And so we used that same model. Now, I can't recommend that now because we ran into a painful puzzle that still isn't solved in Palo Alto. And in Seattle, they got out of that model as quickly as they could. Padma and Hriman are very savvy financially and did not want to try to stay with that tenants in common model. So I don't know what particular model to now recommend, but I'm sure there are ones that are being considered and could work. But it had difficulties. But the main thing was getting through all these meetings, getting people all on the same page, because we literally, I'd said earlier about how time-consuming consensus is. Well, this situation demanded consensus. There wasn't anybody who was going to invest in it unless they felt 100% good about it. So we had to win everybody over to every detail. And it took months. We had one notable explosion where one of the potential investors, really in all innocence, took the agreement that we were asking everybody to sign, which is this tenants in common agreement, took it to her lawyer that she'd worked with for years on other things. And her lawyer just freaked out and said, this is the worst possible thing you could do. Whatever you do, don't do this. So then, in order to get her talked in off the ledge, we had to go get other attorneys who were familiar with the tenants in common agreement. And we had to have everybody who wanted to come across the lake into Bellevue, go to this giant high-rise offices and cram in with those attorneys. And they explained why the tenants in common wasn't so bad. And we finally got everybody, we got all the cats herded in the right direction. And we got the deal signed and people put forward the money and it was ours. But it wasn't easy. There was a lot of laughter, a lot of fun, a lot of camaraderie, but a lot of difficult times. There were people who, you know, really were nervous about it, understandably, because we were asking people to put, you know, significant amounts of money forward to get the down payment and get this functioning. Then when we finally got in there, our plan was to bring everybody in as units opened up. And so we told the tenants, you know, that we were new owners, and we put in a new apartment manager. And then someone told them, and it wasn't one of us, someone from somewhere told them that we were going to evict them all in the next couple of weeks. And there was just a mass exodus. They all got out of there sooner than we could possibly even have evicted them. We kept saying, no, please don't go. Because suddenly we had all of the financial responsibility for paying the mortgage on this apartment complex, but we didn't have any tenants because we couldn't get people in fast enough. And then we discovered, because everyone had left, and we now sort of said, well, okay, let's start fixing things up. Let's start renovating. And I don't want to tell you the real horror stories. I'll tell you some of the less horrible stories. But some of the less horrible stories all involved fleas. That everybody who worked there fixing it up got fleas to one degree or another. Because it was a funky place, you know, it had funky tenants and left unbelievable squalor and trash behind them. But we got it all fixed up, we got everybody in, and it worked really well. It's been going now for 25 or more years and has been a great anchor point for Seattle. So part of your process, you're all joining in here, is not living in a community, it's getting a community and setting it up and getting it ready so you can then live in it. And the first stage can be also part of the honeymoon, can be fun and challenging and develop a lot of camaraderie, but it's all part of the process.
Why don't we throw it open for questions now?
Okay. Feel free to just unmute yourself and start talking.
I'm curious how the village operates, in the sense of, my understanding is that everyone who lives there, works there, So I'm curious how, that works as far as I know most people live in their own homes, or there's their like group homes, or I'm not really all that familiar with how the financial thing works there. I mean,
Okay, good question. So for most of Ananda's history, I think all of it, I'm not even sure in the early days that everybody worked in the community, but it certainly isn't that way now and hasn't been for decades. Really what the shaper of the reality is how much money you need to earn. So what has generally happened is couples with children just could not earn enough working in an Ananda community business. And so they had to find another way. In some cases, they started their own businesses. And starting your own business, as you know, is a lot easier than it once was due to the internet, and is more realistically practical. But in the early days, most of the guys who had families ended up going out and being the breadwinners by being carpenters. And we had one or more contractors, general contractors, who ran their own individual businesses, and various carpenters and tradesmen that lived at Ananda would work for them on different houses. And that would allow them to earn enough to, support modestly still a child or two. And usually the moms would do whatever extra work they could find to help make ends meet. There may have been some cases where the woman in the partnership had earning power to be the breadwinner, and then the man in the partnership, if there was a man in the partnership, would take care of the kids and house and family, et cetera. But that really drove, and still very common for the men who have families in the community to work as carpenters. It's less because of this revolution with the internet and the fact that you can make significant money from a distance. So after one chapter at Ananda, where I ended up with 4 kids, I went out and started my own business. And I started a web development company that eventually grew to 40 employees. And we had an office in San Francisco. We had offices up here. And then the 2001 dot-com bubble burst. We shrank way down. And when we shrank way down, we also left bricks and mortar offices behind, and we all started working out of our homes because it was easy, practical, and cheap. So there are more ways to earn money. And now with the pandemic, you've got big companies that pay enormous salaries who are wanting people to work at home. So I think there are more possibilities there than ever. But the rest of the people in the community who could afford to work at what we lovingly call devotee wages would do so. And you have to live a very modest lifestyle and or have some kind of additional income. Maybe you have a trust fund, maybe you had savings when you came, maybe you inherit while you're here. But it's very, very difficult to live on devotee wages only. But it's very inviting too, because these are the jobs where you get to work every day with devotees, and you get to do the things that make your heart sing. You get to help online with Ananda, teach meditation all over the world. You get to sell books for Crystal Clarity. You to be at the Expanding Light and greet guests and be in that flow of the spread of teachings. It's very powerful. It's a wonderful opportunity. And in any community you start, it's just about guaranteed that you will figure out at least one of those businesses that you can do that with. We have a number of our urban communities started bookstores. In the case of Palo Alto, they had 2 bookstores across the street from each other, which I thought was always sort of charming. Ramurti started a used bookstore, and we have East West down there still. But bookstores are nice because you can choose spiritual bookstores, and so maybe you're not offering everyone the teachings that are most beloved to you, but you're offering them teachings, you're offering them upliftment, and it feels positive in that context. So there's, in every community I know of, there is this balance between having some businesses that people can work in who don't need to make a lot of money, and then other businesses or just people working outside for other businesses to make the ends meet. Now, you also mentioned housing. Housing has been a big challenge at Ananda. It's one of the reasons why apartment communities are so naturally successful, is because you have places for 20, 30, 50, 60 people to live right away. You don't have to rebuild them. You don't have to build them from scratch. Ananda Village did not start out that way. Ananda Village started out with virtually no housing. And so for a good 10 years or more, Ananda got away with bringing in little travel trailers and living in teepees and building what we affectionately referred to as plastic palaces, which were, just rough wooden boxes where you stapled clear plastic onto it so that you'd stay out of the rain. And that worked for, as I say, maybe 10 years, but it was only because we were flying under the radar of the county building department. And once they really realized how many people were living at Ananda and the fact that there was no permitted buildings anywhere to be found, we suddenly had to start building everything to code. And it has been a very slow process because the community itself doesn't have the money to just build a house. So it always fell to the lot of individuals to figure out some way or another to come up with the money to build a house. And now, 45 years on, even a minimum house built to code is eye-wateringly expensive. So it is a very big advantage to you guys to go the apartment route, because you've got places to live right off, and then everybody pays rent, and so you can pay for the apartment house right off. You bring your own renters with you, and it works. And it's not that hard to find apartment complexes that might work for you, and you might get a really good deal. If you do go rural, and I would say the big power of a rural community is that when you have it and you got people living in it, everybody is much more centered there. For a large number of people, there really is work, home, school, and church in one place. And your contact with people is more focused. In apartment communities, because you can get jobs outside of the devotee jobs that you might create, you have people working, kind of where they have been working now. So you don't get quite the same intensity. It depends on what role you have. Dharmadevi and Narayan would probably say that it gets pretty intense in their situation right now. But others of you might not, who are, living and working at a distance from the center. So that's the power of a rural community. But the challenge of the rural community is you have to build it. You might get fortunate and find a good starter package. You might find something that's got a couple of houses on it already that you could convert to being your community center, and you might be zoned correctly for more houses to be able to be built. But it's a lot of hard work, and it's harder now than it ever was to sneak under the radar like we did for so long, and live willy-nilly. You might do some of it, you probably would. You probably want to. You probably get away with it. But you might not get away with it for as long as 50 years ago. So pros and cons there. But housing becomes the key thing. And if you have 25 or 30 or 40 people who all want to roll into this right off, then that's a bigger challenge for rural, unless you can get people living in trailers and just kind of hide them behind the barn, so when anybody comes by they won't know. Or you have a lot of young guys, and it usually always happens to the young guys, who end up living practically on top of each other in some funky big room space, and there's 10 of them in there. And you can get away with that sometimes too, but it won't last. It's not a sustainable solution, but it can work. And the other thing, of course, is you got to go where the opportunity opens up. If you have the opportunity for the rural, and it's maybe not ideal, but maybe the money is there for some reason, or maybe it's more doable, then by all means do it. If the apartment complex, on the other hand, it's more doable, then you may want to do that first. You have to really be practical in your idealism, as Master said. You have to find something that you can really make happen.
Puru, thank you so much for sharing with us tonight. It's been very inspiring and practical. I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit about that mentality of leadership and decision making from a Dwapara Yuga perspective. I read something really fascinating that Swami said in Religion in the New Age, where he was saying that both end, that sort of black or white mentality, is a Kali Yuga approach, and that, either or is Kali Yuga, and that both end is more Dwapara Yuga thinking. So I was wondering if you could offer us some thoughts about how we can be in that both end, open, flexible stream of consciousness, so that we can, be ready and prepared for whatever opportunities present themselves.
I think you're doing it. I think you all are just opening yourself to possibility. Magnetism is a very real and very powerful thing. and to have many minds all thinking the same thoughts with the same goals, it will bring you something. I have no doubt that you can find something. I have no doubt that you can make this happen. It may not fall neatly into the two options that I've been talking about. You may discover a third option. You may have a hybrid. But I have no doubt you can do it, that you will find something that gets you all excited and you make a commitment. Then after that, it's the leadership, the Dwapara aspect of it, I think, is perhaps just a greater sense of possibility. I don't know if that's exactly a Dwapara trait, but it's certainly a powerful trait for anyone who wants to be successful at anything, is just the confidence that it can happen and to open to that. I often think of it as a treasure hunt. I had an experience when I first went up to Seattle. I was asked to go up there literally 2 weeks before school was going to start. And I had 2 school-age children at that point, and a newborn and a 4th on the way. So I had 2 weeks to come up to Seattle, find a house, and then come back and, get family and kids and go back up, ready for school. So on the way up, I drove up, I was thinking, well, how am I going to do this? I could envision myself being, reading every newspaper and looking at everything that said anything about a place to live in. And I got this one clue, which is you're going to want to have a house that allows your kids to go to a good school system. So that really dialed me in. I was like, okay, where are the good school systems? And I could find that out from people who knew the best school systems in Seattle. And that dialed me into the northern part of Seattle. And then I got a little bit fanciful. And this is where the idea of a treasure hunt came in. Because I thought, okay, Divine Mother, this is your treasure hunt. Now, what is it about a treasure hunt that you know? The thing you know about a treasure hunt is that there is a treasure, right? So I started with affirming that there is a treasure and Divine Mother is going to lead it to me. And I just have to look for the clues and that will bring me to the treasure. But I let go of any doubts of whether I could find a house in the right place in time. I said, okay, it's a given. Divine Mother wouldn't bring me up here if she didn't have someplace in mind already. I just have to figure out where it is. Now, I can't say that that necessarily, it will always be true for you. But in this case, it was sort of thrillingly true because I would see things and I would sort of think, is that a clue? That's a clue. But I didn't know what the clue was. And I would go drive into a 7-Eleven and there'd be a big pile of those flyers that you see at every 7-Eleven, which are local one ads and real estate listings and stuff. And I'd go through that. And then I got this was the most fun one, is I got this idea that I could probably get the kind of information I needed at the local library. So I was in the area that had the school system that I thought was going to work for the kids. And so I looked for the nearest library. I had a map. I saw there was a library there. So I headed for the library, only I got turned around and I didn't know it. I was basically lost. But I looked up and I saw a sign that said library. And I thought, oh, great. I didn't really know I was lost. And I saw the sign that said librarian. I went there and I pulled up into a high school parking lot. And what I had seen was the sign for the school library. And in that moment, I knew, oh, this is where Michelle is going to go to high school. And so then I knew I was close. I'm really close. I found the school district. I found the actual school. And then I went into the next 7-Eleven that I saw. And the flyers were hot off the press. They usually are there for like a week, right? And so after a week, any good place in there is going to be gone. So they were, they were warm to the touch practically. Opened them up, saw something that fit. I looked it up on the map. It was literally less than a mile away from the high school. And I called and nobody had taken it yet. And I got that house. So have some fun with it. It will come. Just assume you will find it, whatever Divine Mother wants you to find, and open up to the magnetism and the joy of figuring out where, what, and how.
Beautiful. Thank you, Puru.
My pleasure. Any other questions? Any other stories that you want to tell? I see Chidambar. He could probably share a few stories about getting Palo Alto going.
What it took was an awful lot of energy, belief, and you had to work with a number of people, and not all of them stuck. You had to really put your heart into it, and you had to actually commit with everything you had and believe it. And once you get that going, you have a chance to have a community. But it really requires something. You can't just sit and talk about it, because the talkers go away.
The doors stay. Anyone else?
The question that came to my mind is, how do you handle during this community setting, maybe take Ananda Village as an example, with people that like fall on hard times? Fine.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
You're muted.
Ron Murty didn't want me to answer that. It can be very challenging. I mean, for some people, it just never works. And they give it their all, they run out of money, and they got to go. And the community has, in our situation here at Ananda Village, has never been able to take on people, for a salary where there was not an absolute need to be employing someone. We didn't have the luxury of jobs to give to keep somebody employed. And keep in mind that some of the money that employs people is being paid in by the residents, so there's a certain number of jobs that have to do with just managing the community as a community, and not managing a business that is bringing in other income. So it was just very challenging. Now, a lot of folks like that, I am happy to say I would run into years later who had found their way to, say, working in Sacramento and living at the Sacramento apartment community. And that it worked, finally worked. They got enough money, they had a job that would work for them. But there haven't been the resources to take on people for whom they were just unable to provide for themselves. Swami was very insistent about that. I don't know that we would have had any choice in the matter anyway, but Swami was always very insistent that people need to stand on their own 2 feet. He used to joke that when asked what was the most important yoga posture, he would say, standing on your own 2 feet, taking responsibility for yourself and working it out. So that has always been a strong guideline within any of the communities. There's another thought that keeps eluding me. Oh, and that was paired with his strong feeling that Ananda, when it was just starting, should not pursue a communal lifestyle where you're all, taking your meals from a common place and getting a stipend of $25. He said that it can work for small groups. A CC is more like that. A CC does have much more of a communal feeling, but it tends to not work at all well for families. As soon as you get families into that situation, then as a father, you come to the whatever committee it is that's in charge of increasing stipends or providing more goods to people. And you say, look, I need, $500 a month to clothe and get my kids to school. And that's like $400 a month more than anybody else gets. And it so unbalances the dynamic that families just go elsewhere. So in a CC, what has happened there is that you have a core of singles or couples that are childless who live in that communal style, and then ringed around the community are families who make their living in some other way and take care of their housing in some other way. But in either case, the standing on your own 2 feet advice was the key.
Any other questions or comments or thoughts that you want to add tonight?
When does your new book come out? Because I have your other 2 books. I actually took your course that you did about a year ago, The Physics of God.
Well, this is very dangerous when you ask an author about what they're doing. And we have very few minutes left in our hour and a half. I am working on the book that Ramurti alluded to, but the title has morphed. And I am now on easily title number 9. It started as The Psychology of God, as Ramurti said. And I thought that people would understand it in the same way that they understand the physics of God. But for some reason, very few people got it, that it was going to be a book about how psychology and neuroscience especially can be understood in a way that will help you find God. Just like understanding the deeper realms of physics can help you find God by understanding the metaphysics of the universe. But people didn't get it. And so I gave up on the psychology of God with a certain amount of sadness. I like symmetry. I have another book yet in the pipeline that is only in the thought stage, which I'm wanting to call the experience of God. So it would have been a trifecta, the physics of God, the psychology of God, and the experience of God. For those of you who know your metaphysics, that would also be Sat Chit Ananda, being, consciousness, bliss. But I'm not going to get my symmetry. So the title now is, the main title is Neuroscience, Meditation, and God. And then the subtitle is How to Rewire Your Brain to Realize Your Superconscious Potential. So there's a number of books out there now and talks about rewiring your brain. Rewiring your brain is kind of trendy. And there are authors who can help you rewire your brain for various purposes. But I haven't run across any that specifically want to teach you how to rewire your brain to find God. And the beauty of it all is that that's what Master talked about all the time. He talked about how Kriya rewires your nervous system to handle the presence of God. And he talked over and over about how your brain was either your best friend or your worst enemy. And that your brain had grooves in it, as he would say, that would make you flow easily down that groove into some sort of behavior. And if that was a good behavior, then your brain was your friend. If that was a bad behavior, then your brain was not your friend. And he talked in many, many different ways. Affirmations are a way of regrooving your brain. Kriya is a way of regrooving your brain. Just about every practice that he teaches us actually has as a fundamental component rewiring your brain. So I was extremely happy to find all these connections, just as I found numerous connections with the physics of God, because in neuroscience, they're discovering in great leaps and bounds how much your brain is wired for the behavior that you habitually do, and how difficult it is to get out of that behavior once you've wired yourself for it. But that the brain is fundamentally plastic. Neuroplasticity is also, a trendy subject. And almost all of Master's teachings take this principle of neuroplasticity and help you rewire your brain to know God, to be able to have neurological support form in your brain that brings your focus and attention to the point between the eyebrows and holds it there. So when you're first trying to meditate, when you're first trying to practice things like Hung Sa, your attention is wandering all over the place. That's because it's the first time you've done it, and you don't have any neural support for doing that. But very quickly, 4, 5, 6 times you do something, neuroscientists tell us today that you're already forming new neural circuits in your brain to support something you've only done a handful of times. And they build. So the more often you concentrate at the point between the eyebrows and the deeper the experiences you have, the more solidly your forebrain is rewired to help you meditate. And it will not only help you meditate, but it also will turn off the rest of your brain. That is the ongoing chattering roommate that never shuts up. It is the part of your mind that just goes and goes and goes, like a perpetual chain reaction that you know, before you know it, you're thinking of something 25 steps down the line from where you started. That part of your brain loves to be activated. That part of your brain loves to be busy. And the neural circuits that you created to support all of your typical mental trains of thought, your emotions, your habits, your behaviors, all of those neural circuits are lively. They stimulate each other. So you really have a storm of electrical activity going in your mind, going in your brain rather, most of the time. And the challenge for all of us as spiritual seekers is learning how to quiet it, slow it down. And it also changes your outward life. There's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. It was very popular a few years ago. I don't know how many of you might have seen it, but basically a pair of neuroscientists who worked together for many, many years wrote this book because what they discovered is that most people go with their fast thinking and not their slow thinking. And their fast thinking is the automatic responses of our neural circuits. And they called it autopilot, that we tend to just go on autopilot, that our brain, you know, gets a particular stimulus for a cup of coffee. Oh yeah, I'll have a cup of coffee. I love coffee. Let me drink that coffee. And you just go like that all through your day, unless you deliberately slow down and employ slow thinking. And slow thinking is where you actually ask yourself, what do I want to do? And when you ask yourself, you have ideas. It's not as if you don't have other alternative thoughts. But unless you do slow down, you don't even think the alternative thoughts. You just go with your wiring. So I'm really looking forward to getting this book done and getting it out to people because I think it's very timely, it's very trendy. And the more and more I wrote, the more and more quotes I found by Master about you know, the various analogies he used for how the brain works. One of them was, he said, you have an octopus in your brain. You can just sort of see this network of neurons all over your brain that all are hooked up together. And it's also made me very personally much more aware of circuits. Now I just think of it as circuits, you know, and I'll do something and I'll say, well, there went a circuit that just happened. I didn't necessarily make any choice there. And, you know, I watch other people and I see these, you know, snap reactions to things. And I say, well, look at that. That's a circuit. So I look forward to it being done. Meanwhile, hopefully I'm not going to bore you to tears, but I got a great opportunity from the publisher of The Physics of God to do a second edition, because The Physics of God is doing well enough that a second edition is warranted, so they can make another, you know, wave out with it to their sales teams and to foreign translation people, etc. So I'm working on that. The other book has had to go on pause until I can get the second edition done. But I learned just a few weeks ago that The Physics of God has now sold over 20,000 copies. So it's doing well in the realm of books. So I'm really pleased. I mean, I think of that book, honestly, I'm not saying this to sound extra devotee-like, but I really think of this book as Master and Sri Yukteswar's book. There's nothing in there that I didn't meditate on until I felt that I had the right idea in the right context. And that I honestly think the reason it's selling so well is because it has their vibrations in it. It has their truths. It has their amazingly appropriate, modern, accessible to the Western mind spiritual teachings in it. And people just like them. They resonate with them deeply. So thank you. I mean, whoever asked that question, let me know. I'll slip you a $5 next time I see you. But it's been wonderful being with you all, and do start a community. Just don't worry about how hard it is or how impossible or how astronomical the amount of money seems that you're going to have to somehow come up with. Move forward, become magnetic, and things will happen that you can't believe, but they will happen. And it'll be the best time of your life.
Thank you, Puru.
God bless one and all.
Thank you,
God
Puru.
bless you.
Thank you so
My
much.
pleasure.
One of the great things missing about this digital means we're forced to use is you don't get to hear our applause.
I know,
But
it's very
it
strange,
would
especially when
be
you tell a
great.
joke. I mean, comedians talk about dying on the stage, right? You know, it's like, well, was that any good or not? You know, I'm desperately searching for faces. Ron Murthy's good though. He laughs at all my jokes. So I know at least one person is having a good laugh.
Maybe we should
Thank you all.
they should have an attachment for maybe a laugh track like on TV. Someone says someone just push a button and the laughter comes up and then applause sound.
Yeah, I think
Zoom
one of
should
the
have-
late night hosts tried that. And it was very surreal because he would sit on his front porch because he's in quarantine. And he would do his monologue. And every time he would tell a joke, he'd then reach down and, you know, press the button on his computer and there'd be all this laughter. It was very weird. But
It
you know
sounds
what
like-
is weirder? Is
sounds like
watching
Robert
them
De
do
Niro.
the monologue with no laughter.
Oh,
That sounds like Robert De Niro in The King of Comedy.
Uh-huh.
Thank you again, Puru. So glad you could be with us tonight. Great to see you.
Best of luck, one and all.